Anzac is very important to us as Indigenous, but it's more important probably over the last few years. We didn't know too much about Indigenous history about Indigenous soldiers, because all the names that was mentioned, there was only two. There was a principal from Hamilton that came down and visited us, knocked on the door. He said, I just left RSL and I noticed an Indigenous photo on the wall down there. And I asked the question, do they know of any more Indigenous soldiers? And they said no. So since then, he researched and finally found that there was 26 that come off this old mission station. And the 26 included my uncle, that I was surprised, because growing up on the mission station, I can always remember my uncle wearing an army jacket, and because we weren't allowed to ask questions, we always thought that he got it from the hop shop. Lo and behold, he was in the service and he served out of Queensland. But the thing about my uncle was that he served twice. He didn't last too long the first time. The second time that he signed up, he served 12 months as a gunner. The research showed that there was more family members. There was my great uncle that also served in the First War. And then there was my wife's grandfather and uncles. And then when we started to do some research ourselves, we found more stuff about what they had to go through, even to sign, to become soldiers in the Australian Army. Some of the things weren't very nice. The worst thing about it is when they left the Army and what they had to face. They couldn't go into a hotel and have a beer, or they couldn't even walk down the street. You know, they'd get abused and spat on. But our people went through hell. But they survived it. It's up to us now to keep passing that message on to the younger generation and to the wider public too, because I was invited to do a talk and it was about Indigenous soldiers. But one of the people in the audience popped up and said, well, what about us, meaning non-Indigenous? Yeah, our people did fight with non-Indigenous people. And they made great friends. But once again, those uniforms were taken off. They became enemies. You know, right up until 1967, you know, our people that fought for this country wasn't acknowledged as Indigenous people. Well, acknowledged as, well, they was virtually acknowledged as scum. But now, you know, like I said, we as a community, we need to start educating younger generation, tell the stories to them and the wider audience. When our Indigenous soldiers finally registered, they had to sign two forms. One was to say they weren't Aboriginals, and the other form was to say they was Islanders. So they was accepted as Islanders to serve and fight for this country. There was an Aboriginal fellow that came off the mission, he was born there. He served in the First War. His name was Herbert Murray. And he was one of the first Aboriginal tunnellers to tunnel under enemy lines in World War I. His job was to go under mines, dig through tunnels, under hills, come up on the other side of the enemies. So all his mates could bring gunfire, whatever they had to need to carry to get through the tunnel to get on the other side. We found out there was more than 26 that came off the mission. So in all, there was probably close to nearly 1,000 that served and fought for our country, but never had the acknowledgement. A lot of non-indigenous soldiers, when they served and came back, they got soldier settlements. When ours that came back, all they got was abuse. Our soldiers, when they had uniforms on, same as the non-indigenous, they were great mates. They served together, they fought together. As soon as our indigenous soldiers took their uniforms off, they were treated like scums. And here our soldiers served this country to fight, to save this country. Then Peter came up with the idea, let's do something for all the indigenous soldiers in this area and acknowledge them. So he ran away and got some funds. But there was enough to create a small memorial, and that was placed just opposite the RSL, going back 12 years ago. We had a bit of strife, trying to convince non-Indigenous and even Indigenous people that we needed to have something to acknowledge our soldiers, the men and women that served. So on the 1st of November 2010, our stone, our small memorial, was launched. And people came from far away as Western Australia. Also, there was a family that came back from America, Indigenous family, to be at a small gathering when the first Victorian Indigenous memorial was opened. And every year, on the 1st of November, we celebrate Indigenous servicemen and women that served and fought. And a lot of them lost their lives by doing that. Oh, look, it was surprising. When you find out there was more than two that came off the settlement here, in the surrounding districts, which is probably close to 1,000, is opened everyone's eyes, even the government's eyes, even the War Department's eyes. Well, I always tell the story about my youngest son, Rob. He said, "Dad, I want you to come into the schools to tell some of your stories." And I said to him, "I can't do that. You know why I can't do that. Because we weren't allowed to tell our stories to anyone else other than the family." And he finally convinced me. Started off by telling just a small part of what life was like for me growing up on this mission station, and what we faced and what we seen and what we witnessed. I stopped because two of the teachers were crying. I apologised because I thought I might have offended them or said something out of place, and they said to me, "Rob, no, we need to apologise to you because we never knew none of this." And that's the thing. Our history, our war history, our Indigenous soldiers were kept quiet. And there had to be a reason why it was kept quiet. I don't know that reason. But it just seems a pity that they weren't acknowledged when everyone else was acknowledged. You know, you got some, say, famous names of the Indigenous soldiers that served, and they are the ones that's been recognised, but they forget about the ones that also served but never got that same acknowledgement and recognition. And that's the disappointing thing about it. Like the 26 that came off here, the mission station. I don't think too many people would know that. There was 26 that came off this little mission station and served. You know, Herbert Murray was born on this mission station. He went to Germany and tunnelled under enemy lines. He survived. He came back. He's buried in Bansale. But he went to war to serve his country and never got the recognition. You know, and you know, you can go on, you can talk about the 26, but everyone deserves a special mention. But once again, it's got to me, it's got to come back to family members. Like these plaques here is being put here because me and my wife, we had to do something to acknowledge our ancestors. And we got these made to make people aware there are other family members whose family have served, and if they can do exactly the same thing to acknowledge those 26, you can have this stone beautiful with acknowledgement on it, and young generations can come and read that their family members, their ancestors, their great-great-great-grandparents fought for this country. People come to see this and I look at this rock and they just see this and think it's a rock, but this rock tells a story now, and it tells the story of our indigenous soldiers. That's what it's about. It's got a storyline, and that storyline needs to be told by the younger generation. We know we go back to my uncle walking the mission in the army code, and no one questioned him. And he didn't come out and say, look, I served in the Australian forces. It was a fear. And it was probably the humiliation they had to go through. And he probably wanted to keep that to himself, like most of them did. So, but it is sad. It is sad in the long term because here I am up until 12 years ago, weren't any wiser. And if we can get those other family members to go out and get plaques, if they got the information on their family, and put them on this rock. Now, this story can go on forever, but if we can see flagpoles placed there, our people can come to this rock on Anzac morning and celebrate Anzac Day, where they pay respects to their own people.
My name is Doug Hazelwood. I was a regular Army officer from 1966 to 1988. Following my return from Vietnam in 1967, I was posted to the Army Jungle Training Centre in Canungra, Queensland. My job was known as the adjutant, and I worked directly with the Commandant, then Colonel Ted Griff, MC, a man who I came to greatly admire. Ted was one of a significant group of infantry officers who had served with distinction in World War II and Korea, many of whom had been decorated for significant acts of bravery on more than one occasion. When Ted became the Commandant at Canungra, a place which had figured in their training for many years, a succession of these men, who were legends of their time, came to pay him a visit. It was Ted's idea of a good joke to have them to his expansive office for a cup of tea and to have me make and serve the tea, so they would see that he rated a captain as his tea boy. This was far from any joke though, because the payoff for me was that I would be asked to remain while these great men spoke of legendary feats of the past, and I would be allowed to speak to them. Among those who visited or were spoken about were absolute legends like George Wharf, Benny O'Dowd and Charlie Green, to name but a few. One who I remembered being mentioned often was called Reg Saunders, who I didn't meet but knew was a popular choice to have been commissioned as an officer in the field late in World War II, they would have his respect. I felt privileged to be drawn into many conversations. I thought often about those meetings for years afterwards, without being able to pursue the stories any further. That is, until I came across this book. It's called An Embarrassing Australian, and the author was a prominent journalist and war correspondent called Harry Gordon. When I picked it up, I soon realised that it was all about Captain Reg Saunders, one of my legends from Canungra, and it turned out that he had been the very first Aboriginal Australian to be a commissioned officer in the Australian Army. I couldn't put it down, and I've read it more than once. I therefore came to know the life story of a legend. The great men had never mentioned he was an Aboriginal Australian. They didn't think it important to do so. And what a story. Many people will have known something or other about Reg Saunders, but relatively few will know of the full extent of the varied and adventurous life he led. His life outside the army began when he was born near Warrnambool on the Framingham Aboriginal Reserve in August 1920. His father, Chris, had served with distinction in World War I, as had his uncle, William Reginald, or Reg Rawlings, who Reg Saunders was named after. Reg Rawlings' photograph has long been on display in this sub-branch, notably for his award of the Military Medal for Bravery, and his name is chiselled into the Killed in Action panel of the Great War names on the memorial outside. Reg had a younger brother, Harry, a couple of years younger, before their mother died from complications arising from the birth of what would have been their younger sister. Reg's father moved to the Condar mission shortly after that, and Reg and Harry grew up there, were well schooled, and Chris, Reg and Harry had a living there, working in a nearby sawmill. At the outbreak of World War II, Reg and Harry were encouraged to enlist by their father, and both signed up in 1940, in time to join the 6th Division of the 2nd AIF, the first Australian division to go overseas to North Africa. There followed a very adventurous career. His battalion, the 2nd 7th, was committed to the abortive campaign in Greece. In a rearguard action, the ship evacuating Reg's battalion, almost the last, was bombed and he was rescued by a British destroyer, found himself on Crete. When that island fell to the Germans, Reg refused to surrender and was one of those who spent about 11 months hiding out with the Cretan underground. As you can imagine, that had its difficult moments for a dark-skinned Australian Aboriginal. Being picked up again, this time by a British submarine, he was subsequently evacuated to Australia and rejoined his old unit on the Atherton Tablelands in 1942. At about that time, his younger brother Harry was killed in action in New Guinea, where he had been serving with the 2nd 14th Battalion, the first of the AIF units to meet and hold up against the Japanese advancing along the Kokoda track. Reg also served in the 1943 New Guinea campaign, which is where he would have met George Wharf, legendary commander of the 2nd 14th Independent Company. On again returning to Australia, George was first promoted to sergeant, then, in 1944, attended an officer training school in Seymour and graduated as a lieutenant. In 1944, the first Aboriginal soldier ever to do so in the Australian Army. He returned to his old unit and commanded a platoon of Australians, all of whom had more rights as citizens than he did. After a further campaign of mopping up in New Guinea, along with his unit, he was returned to Australia to be demobbed in October 1945. Reg found life outside of the army pretty boring, and so further military service beckoned him. At that time, there was a campaign to recruit people to go to the British Commonwealth Occupation Force in Japan, despite the qualifications he might have had the eminent qualifications he might have had to join that, they were not taking Aboriginals. From 1945 to 1950, Reg was employed as a tram conductor, or a clippy as we used to know them then, a dock worker and a builder's labourer. He was always employed, but not to his great satisfaction at all. Then in 1950, with the raising of what was called then K-Force, it was a different story about needing manpower. They needed good soldiers, so suddenly there's room for Aboriginals as well. So Reg joined the 3rd Battalion, the Royal Australian Regiment, whose commanding officer at the time he joined was Charlie Green, one of my legends who I remember being mentioned at Canungra. Reg became a platoon commander with A Company, worked for Benny O'Dowd, a very hard taskmaster who has written him up really well. When Benny was wounded for a short while, he was acting officer commanding A Company. He was then moved to C Company to give them a bit more strength in professional leadership, and he became quickly the second in command of C Company and the officer in command of C Company. So Reg fought through the Battle of Kap Yong, which was a great action, the major action involving the Australians in the Korean War, where the Australians, the Canadians, arrested the flow southward of Chinese division towards the South Korean capital of Seoul. He also took part in the Battle of Mariang San, not so well known, but nevertheless a very important Australian battle in the Korean War. All of the leadership there provided by Reg Saunders was done while he still needed to carry a certificate saying that he was permitted to drink beer. He led a very distinguished military career. After he left the army, he employed himself in several ways, but his major later career was with the newly formed Department of Aboriginal Affairs for the Commonwealth Government. That's a nutshell, that's a very short story of a very much bigger character and a very larger, longer story. That was Reg Saunders. I'd now like to speak briefly to introduce a fellow named John Burns. I met John in 1966 when I joined the 103rd Field Battery of the Royal Australian Artillery in Vietnam. John Burns had grown up as a young Aboriginal boy on the south side of Brisbane. He wasn't part of the stolen generation, but also never knew his birth parents. A young Aboriginal boy in the southern suburbs of Brisbane has every right to not know with any certainty his ultimate place in Australian society. I'll leave John to tell you about when he joined the army, but what I would like to talk about briefly is how John realised that it was possible to be an Aboriginal and an Australian. This happened during the Battle of Long Tan in 1966, when 103 Battery was an important ingredient of our success. He's the only artillery soldier, to my knowledge, to have participated in the battles of Long Tan and Fire Support Base Coral, which were the two largest and most important battles of the Vietnam War, to have relied on the artillery to win the day.
It's nearly 50 years since that happened, and it still feels like only last week that we were loading our gun and stores on a Chinook to fly up to occupy Fire Support Base Coral. Anyway, night time, it must have been about 2 o'clock in the morning, I heard some shots, and the next thing, this RPG went straight across the top of the bun. The mortars were landing, and then there was this big bang. The Battle of Coral was, as far as we knew, had never been done in our century anyway. An artillery battery being actually attacked by ground forces. Normally The artillery is further back from the front. You know, you might take a few mortar rounds or rockets, something fired from a distance, but that night they were there right in front of us and overran one of the guns. I think that night there was a real bond formed between every member of the battery, and it's still as strong now as it was then. We'd survived something that we'd never ever thought we'd encounter, and you know, everyone was elated in that way, but sad in another for the people that we had lost. We ended up with 48 body count around the battery area, and after we'd cleaned up and they made a mass grave, Father Tinkler arrived, and he couldn't believe he came to have a service. All personnel on that gun position attended Father Tinkler's church service, and he even said, so this is what it takes to get a large congregation at my services. We felt thankful that we'd got through the night. You know, my main thoughts was after Coral was, you know, we survived, and that was one thing I wanted to do so that I could get back to Australia and to my fiancée, because I was so much looking forward to getting married and living the rest of my life with her. You know, I sat down and wrote and told Mum what was happening, but then I thought, I've gone too far. That's why I wrote an apology letter to let her know that everything was all right and it wasn't as bad as maybe I painted the picture, you know. But I resisted and still resist to this day taking any medication or things that the psychologists and doctors say, you know, PTSD, you take this and take that. But just talking about it, you're not bottling it up like a lot of people. You know, people say, how did you survive all this time? You know, my brother did this and my dad did that and whatever, and a couple of my friends have committed suicide. You know, guys that I looked up to when I was a young gunny hung themselves and shot themselves, and I thought, no, why? You know, these were great guys. These were men of men, sort of thing. You know, I really hope that you never ever see anything, any action in a war zone. The army was like my family then. I felt secure there. It's a part of a life that I went through with a lot of great guys. We created a bond there, and it'll never be broken. The Battle of Coral and the members of 102 Battery, Coral Battery, will always be together, either here or up in the big mess in the sky.
I'd just like to see more people get involved in it. I know it's going to be hard, but over the 12 years that we've launched that stone, probably the most we ever had at one day, which is the 1st to the 11th, probably 50, and that was only on one occasion. The rest is probably about 5 or 6, but we still celebrate the men and women. We still talk about what they did for us, and that's the reason why we go to those services on the 1st to the 11th. You know, it's not about individuals. It's about what our ancestors that served means to us, to show us, and we pay that respect to them. The more we can talk to the younger generation, hopefully they'll get more involved. This year, the 1st of 11th this year, although we'll be celebrating 11 years, we hope to have a 10-year celebration, and we hope to have more community members there, non-Indigenous and Indigenous people, sitting shoulder by shoulder, having a laugh around a table. That would be great to see, but we can only hope. Open it up to the wider community. Be proud of it. Don't hide it. Because the more we keep hiding it, the worse it's going to get. Our younger people are not going to know nothing. And to me, that's the most important thing. Ever since I started doing this program with young Rob, I started to realise that myself. The most important people are the next generation. We lived our time. It's like I always keep saying, the ancestors left us a legacy. And we need to cherish that legacy and carry it on. But when we're gone, that's when the young ones need to take over.